Belinda Gordon. I'm an independent policy consultant. And in the interest of openness, I should say that I'm doing some work at the moment with the Food Farming Countryside Commission on a land use framework. So I'm immersed in this subject that we're about to discuss. And I'm really looking forward to learning from the 4 expert speakers that we have. You know, the last session, we sort of focused on one particular aspect of land use, greenhouse gas removals and the complexities of that. In this session, we're going to kind of zoom out a bit and look at land use as a whole and the multiple things it has to deliver, with the question, can we have it all from the land? And this is a topic that seems to be sort of coming to the fore at the moment. You know, Chris Skidmore's review last week mentioned the need for a more strategic management of land. We had the Dasgupta review a few years ago, which showed how all our economic activity is actually based on nature and land. And it all adds up to the fact that we need to manage it better. We want so much from the land, we need to manage it better. And those of you in the room will have seen this new report from Green Alliance on your seats. I think the link's going to be sent at the end of the session for people who've joined online. And this sort of sets out how we can deliver food, nature and climate in the UK by using land better. And I'm going to hand over in a moment to Dustin, who helped write the report, who's going to talk us through it a bit. I'm then going to ask each of our speakers, including Helen, who is joining online, to say a few introductory comments. And then I'm going to go out to the audience and try and make this, you know, post-lunch slot nicely interactive and engaging for everyone. So get your questions ready. I'll let the speakers introduce themselves, and Dustin, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm Dustin Bennett, Policy Director at Green Alliance. And I can say, in fairness, I'm very much a co-author on this report. My colleague Lydia did most of the heavy lifting on the analysis, and it's a very analytical report, which is on purpose, because when we look at the land system, what we see is lots of conversations which are held in adjectives. And if we want to make a change in the land system for nature and for carbon and for food, we need to also talk about numbers. So we tried to provide some numbers to illustrate the sorts of challenges, trade-offs, opportunities, and pathways that we might choose in decarbonising, restoring nature, and growing all the lovely food that we need to do out of our land system. So I want to answer the question, which this panel is meant to, which is, you know, can we have it all? And the answer is yes, but. And the but is where the detail comes in, and the difficulty. The first bit of the but is yes, but not without absolutely unprecedented change in the land system. And I think we need to be straight about the nature of that change. We need to be open and honest, because that change ought not to be scary, but if we try to hide it, we will find that it sneaks up on us and we don't end up doing it. And the second is that we, yes, we can, but we have to grapple with trade-offs in how we use land, and we need to adjudicate between those trade-offs openly, transparently, and thoughtfully. And I would also add democratically, although the next panel will focus a bit more on that. Because if we don't do that, we won't actually achieve the outcomes that we want to achieve. So I'm going to mention 2 trade-offs and then give you a bit of a sense of scale of change. The first trade-off is basically just to do with the way the land system fundamentally works. Land that grows food tends to release carbon rather than storing it. And in a net zero world, the land system is the net zero. It's the bit that has to do the lion's share of sequestration, whether through natural carbon sequestration or whether through BECCS, as the previous panel discussed. The second is, and this is a little bit more complicated, so I'm oversimplifying. I've got an excellent conservation biologist right next to me who will give you the God's own truth here. But basically, the more food you grow on any patch of land, the less suitable it is for nature. So there are these fundamental trade-offs. And in essence, the conclusion is if we don't reduce both the intensity and the quantity of land that we use to grow food in the UK, it doesn't look possible to meet either our domestic nature or our domestic carbon targets. So you have to ask, what can you do to free up the land? This poses another big, interesting, challenging problem, which I think we need to be open and transparent about, and that is about how much meat we consume. The meat that we eat uses 85% of all of the land that's used to feed the UK. That provides around a third of our calories. It's disproportionate, therefore, if you need to free up land or to intensify, you have to think and talk about it. It's a trade-off. You want to keep our meat consumption high and hit our domestic carbon and nature targets, you offshore production with all the attendant challenges associated with that. If we don't want to offshore things, then we have to work out how we can eat less meat to make space for nature and carbon sequestration. We have tried in this report, in our preferred scenario, to answer those trade-offs, to give a view on how you might adjudicate between those, not because we think there is one truth. In fact, we've tried to give you 5 different scenarios, but to go the conversation into a how might we adjudicate between these trade-offs. Our answer to that trade-off is technology. Half the meat that we eat in the UK is processed or pre-prepared. It comes in supermarket lasagnas or bits of chicken in a salad or something like that. Alternative proteins can replace all of that technically, and we think that that new technology ought to be encouraged and used to supplant the processed products of big industrial meat production to free up space for more agroecological farming on one hand and more semi-natural habitats for nature and for carbon. To be clear, this is not a sort of vegan scenario. The vision is one in which the mince in your moussaka maybe is plant-based or precision fermentation derived, but the steak on a Friday night or a Sunday roast comes from a well-reared British animal. That's the first trade-off. We've tried to bite the bullet and say, here's how we manage it. The second is a trade-off associated with cost and beneficiaries, and it touches on the BECS panel that we previously had. If the land system needs to provide the net in net zero, and we choose not to pay British farmers to change land use to semi-natural habitat and to farm much more agroecologically, then you have to pay for a lot more BECS, and it's expensive. The analysis we've done, my colleague Lydia has led, suggests that the total cost is about double for the British taxpayer if you go for a high BECS route and you don't support farmers to change land use, versus one in which you do, and that most of the money in that more expensive scenario flows not to British land managers, but probably overseas, to overseas biomass production and to BECS plants. That's a really challenging bit of politics and poses a clear trade-off both about the total cost and who we want beneficiaries to be. Our answer is to pay farmers to guarantee their tenure, because we think that most of the challenges associated with land use change are about people fearing that they will be turfed off their land. The analysis we've done says we're not going to turf anyone off their land, we're going to guarantee they're able to keep it, and that they can increase their farm incomes if they change what they do. But this is just a way of managing the trade-off. It's not the one truth, and there are many alternative ways of doing that. That is the sort of point of doing this analysis that shows we have options, but the options need data. Final point is about scale. We need to be straight about the amount of change that we will need in the land system if we're to get net zero and nature and food. The analysis we've done holds the share of food that's produced in the UK constantly. It meets net zero, it tries to achieve nature targets. In our preferred scenario, just to give you some round numbers, we think that by 2050, around a fifth of all land needs to shift into semi-natural habitat, and around a third of all land needs to shift from intensive farming to massively de-intensified, much more agroecological, wildlife friendly, you name it what you want, type different sorts of farming. That would be, if we just did a linear change, 2% of land in Britain changing every year up to 2050. This is big, it's challenging, it's not unachievable, and we think that by doing the kind of land tenure and economic guarantee, it opens up the prospect for this being a good change. But we have to be open, straight. We think we need a land use framework that makes these trade-offs and the scale of change explicit, that people can begin to think, how do we have a good future in this changed world, rather than fearing that the change is going to upend their livelihoods, identifiability for entrepreneurs. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks very much. That's I think there are lots of interesting options there that we can get into shortly. But I'd like to now ask Tom Finch from the RSPB to say a bit as follow-up, because I know the Green Alliance report used some RSPB data, and this is something that we've been doing a lot of work on for a number of years.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. So yeah, I'm Tom Finch, conservation scientist with the RSPB, and I thought it'd be useful to talk about some of the research that I've been doing in this space, really focused on what's quite an academic debate between two quite polarized alternatives for how we use land. And one of those is that we would meet our food demand over as small an area of land as possible, therefore sparing as much land as we can for unfarmed land, supporting the types of species which depend on, woodlands and wetlands and moorlands. And the other extreme is that we farm as extensively as possible, so lowering those yields, making our farmland more wildlife friendly. The trade-off being that the physical footprint of that farmland is greater and there's less land left for unfarmed habitats. So it's the sharing sparing dichotomy, and the sort of solution that we converged on from our work on this in the UK is that actually a combination of the two approaches is the least bad option. We called it the three compartment approach. Actually, we didn't coin that term, but this is a sort of model that came up top in our research. And the reason it's effective is because it recognizes that there's some wild species which do need those unfarmed landscapes, your woodlands and your wetlands. There's some species, particularly in the UK, which depend on sympathetically managed farmland. So they need some of that lower yielding agroecological organic land. But if you're also trying to meet some food production target, and it doesn't matter what that target is, you maximize the area of those two either lower yielding or zero yielding compartments if you farm the remaining land as productively as you can. Now that doesn't mean that you have to farm that remaining land more intensively than it's currently farmed. You could get away with farming it less intensively if you reduce that overall target by changing diets or reducing waste. But whatever you think you can get away with, while still maintaining the natural capital which that agriculture depends on, the soils, the pollinators, the natural enemies of your pests. If that remaining land is farmed as productively as you can, then you spare as much land as possible for those other compartments. And it's this three compartment approach which some of the Green Alliance scenarios are based on. It's worth recognizing that in the real world we don't just divide land into three compartments. This is a mental model. It's a way of thinking about how we use land. The boundaries between these compartments are blurry. You can imagine subdivisions of each of those compartments depending on local context. But as a mental model, I think it's a powerful way of thinking about how we think about these trade-offs, how we allocate resources to different priorities. And maybe we can pick up some more questions along those lines in the discussion.
Thanks very much, Boy. I'm glad you mentioned that about these are models that are meant to kind of stimulate debate and scenarios that are meant to look at these options and trade-offs. And actually, there is a bit of a gap between us sitting here doing modelling and and actually what's happening on the ground. And I hope in some of the discussion we can maybe sort of get how you sort of close that gap and how the models can work in reality to deliver what needs to be delivered. I'm now going to ask Helen, who hopefully will appear on our screen shortly. Helen works for Chatham House and has done some really interesting research into the assumptions that kind of underlie the different sort of future scenarios for agriculture. So Helen, it'd be great to hear from you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Belinda, and hi everybody. It's great to join you today, unfortunately not in person. Yeah, I just got a few reflections really, rather than kind of going through a backlog of my work on this topic. First of all, just thanks to Green Alliance for the invitation to join, and credit to them for producing this report on what is really such an important yet underreported topic on what are really complex issues and not easy to tackle at all, and will only grow in importance as time goes on. So this report is really valuable now and going forward. I really appreciated the comparisons across the 5 scenarios in the report in terms of the set of metrics provided and some of the costs and the implications for carbon dioxide removal, particularly BECCS. I think for me, a fascinating next step as I was reading and kind of reflecting would be to really tease out the differences, I guess, between scenario 1 and 5. So where are the red lines in scenario 5 compared to 1? What would it take to get to 5, given that that's where most of the benefits were, the sort of the quantifiable benefits, at least in this report. And if we go from 1, if we go for 1, sorry, we rule out some elements of 5, given the long-term nature of restoring carbon sinks. And does that matter globally when we think about climate and nature goals, for example? I think it'd be really useful also to unpack some of the qualitative elements in the report. So, and this is kind of general in this area of research and debate as well. So, for example, what is meant by cultural value, which is mentioned in support of scenario 1? What is this? Who is it valuable to? Where and when? Also to include some of the public health benefits. I think going forward, that would be a really interesting thing to look at. So air pollution, water pollution, zoonotic disease risk, the impacts of the diet changes that are mentioned, and of course, spending the benefits of us spending more time in nature-rich environments would be a really nice thing to look at going forward as well. I think really I'd like to make a strong call as well to bring these scenarios to life. So we have a lot of different scenarios, and this also applies to the UK land use framework as well. I think if we can create simulations and sort of immersive virtual reality experiences to actually make the numbers and what's to be sort of gained and lost from those scenarios much more tangible to the audience, I feel like that could only be a useful thing to actually move us forward. And just to finish with one example from some of the work that I've been involved in a report that we published in 2019, we found that restoring native vegetation cover on 60% of the UK's agricultural land, so that is all classed as permanent pasture, would remove over 3,000 million tonnes of CO2, which is equivalent to around 9.5 years worth of current UK CO2 emissions. So this level of native vegetation coverage, let's say that's a temperate forest, would take the UK to around 36% of land use for naturally regenerating forests, so from its current 1%. And we might think that's quite radical, but actually it's not even as high as some other countries. So for example, Finland has 50% of its land as naturally regenerating forests, and Sweden and Norway already have a third of land coverage of naturally regenerating forests. And as I said, the UK currently has 1%. So while it might seem like a big departure from business as usual for the UK, it's actually not that radical in comparison to some other countries. And I think that's really important to bear in mind when we're thinking about these sorts of scenarios. Action really needs to match the scale of the challenge, and we certainly shouldn't shy away from that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. That was really interesting. For those people who haven't kind of read and memorised the report yet, scenario 1 is the balanced scenario, which kind of the Green Alliance report sort of concludes is, you know, is probably the most achievable and ticks the most boxes. Scenario 5, which Helen was referring to, is one which kind of maximises avoiding greenhouse gas removals, engineered greenhouse gas removals. I think you were really right to raise the question about the definitions of some things there, Helen. I've got a sort of particular question about what sort of semi-natural habitat means, and I know you know, there's debate about, is that actually very low intensity farming, you know, and where does that line lie? But before we get on to these more detailed issues, I'd like to ask Lord Cameron to say a few words, because the government have committed to producing a land use framework for England. I think Therese Coffey has given the deadline of May for the government to produce something. And Lord Cameron chaired a House of Lords committee which specifically looked into land use and produced a report just before Christmas, which I know the government are looking at very closely in drawing up that land use framework.
Great, thank you very much. Can you all hear me at the back? I hope so. Yeah, good. The conclusion we came to was that because we nearly lost the Second World War, because we nearly ran out of food, the government or the country as a whole have been focused on food production only from our land. But bear in mind that in 1939, we only produced 39% of our own food. Now we already produce 60%. It has been higher, but 60% is not a bad figure. It can easily be continued to do using less land with the sort of fat-produced meat that Dustin was talking about, etc. Even milk produced through machines, as they're doing in California already. So we think there's a lot we can do to continue to maintain our food. I'm very much a land sharing person, and I happen to chair the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, which has got 600 scientists, not all looking into this, but all the land-based scientists are very much of my opinion that land sharing is the best way forward. And I can expand on that perhaps during questions, but I'll move on. Because in terms of land use, clearly the appalling drop in our biodiversity is a thing we've got to tackle first. 50% drop in biodiversity in the last 50 years. I mean, I know it's the worst in the G7, but it's pretty well the worst in the world too. And it is absolutely appalling. So that is one thing we've got to really focus on. Net zero obviously is another one. Upland peat, lowland peat, and how we deal with those, and trees. And going on to forestry, we have only 10% of our cover is woodland. We import 90% of our used timber in this country at a cost of some 8.9 billion, 8.5 billion, sorry, down here. And of course, forestry could be very helpful in biodiversity, as well as access, because there was no doubt that COVID highlighted the fact that we don't really use our land enough for people's access to the countryside, particularly near to where people live. We've got our national parks and AONBs, but near to where people live is more complicated. And we produced the idea of using the green belt and having green belt enablers, which actually drove a positive agenda on this green belt, as opposed to just being negative uses of land that we couldn't develop. We develop into sort of horticulture and all sorts of other things like that, which is a bit of a mess. But there's a lot more we can do. Meanwhile, also, I think the war in Ukraine has highlighted the fact that we need more energy from our land. Not only, obviously wind farms, both in the North Sea and floating wind farms off our west coast, but also certainly very much on land, both wind and solar. Probably solar not on our best and most versatile land, but it's certainly something I think energy self-sufficiency is becoming equally as important as food self-sufficiency. And I'm afraid we also definitely need more housing. I mean, I actually think the next general election, the rural vote will be won by the party that puts forward the best solution to providing housing for ordinary people. Where I come from in Cornwall, there are no houses either to rent or to buy. And the NHS, all the businesses, they can't get staff because the people have nowhere to live. There is nowhere to live. And something's we've got to deal with that situation. Again, not on our best and most versatile land, but there are land we can use all our land, but we've got to plan it, we've got to look forward to it. And that's the solution that we came up to in our report, is that we do need some sort of planning in all this. And we propose that we should have a land use commission, which looks into planning not only the use of the land, but also what we're producing from the land. And we hoped, and I'm afraid, unfortunately, we've been sort of sunk below the waterline the last minute. We had hoped that we could get the local nature recovery strategies as being a vehicle for the local delivery. We felt that sort of local people ought to be able to work out what they wanted to use their land for and how they wanted to use it, and work out a way of achieving that. But that seems to have gone away as a method of delivery, which is a great shame. But I'm sure we can still get some form of local delivery into the system if we put up enough pressure. But the main thing to all of this is actually planning it. And also the other main point is multifunctionality. There's absolutely no reason why, if you have food production, you can also have biodiversity and energy. Where you have energy, you can also have biodiversity, and mostly you can have food production. Where you have woodland, you can have access and biodiversity. And equally, where you've got housing, if you plan it correctly, you can have woodland and access to green spaces, etc., etc. And as I keep telling people, it's not rocket science. We just have to sit down and work it out and plan it, and both centrally and above all locally. I'm happy to take any questions.
No, that's great. Thank you very much. I think, yeah, the report done by the committee is really impressive, and we, well, I personally hope that DEFRA are reading it closely and are going to take on board lots of its recommendations. I wonder if I can just, before we go out to the audience for questions, I wonder if I can sort of take the chair's prerogative and just ask maybe Lord Cameron and Tom as people who might be in touch with landowners about how, you know, we've talked about the sort of the scale of change that's needed here, and I think, you know, most of us sort of struggle to grasp how quickly we need to make that change and what that's actually going to look like and the landscape. Do you, you know, in your experience, do you think landowners are kind of up for this scale of change? You know, if they get the right support from government, do you think it's feasible?
Sure, I'll go first, right? I mean, yes, it's very definitely. I mean, it was quite interesting. We had a lot of farmers and landowners, you know, before our committee. We interviewed, I don't know what it was, 140 something witnesses, and virtually all the farmers and landowners, I think it was 1 out of 12, we saw was not in favour of the whole sort of biodiversity and land. I mean, maybe I could just, in answer to your question, talk about this whole land use and land sharing, land sparing debate. Because, I mean, I spent quite a lot of time looking at agriculture in Africa, and undoubtedly in Africa, land sparing, where you keep your sort of biodiversity and your man-managed farm separate, is a good idea. But most of the, in this country, most of our biodiversity has been living alongside man for centuries. And also most of our species depend upon the ability to move through the landscape to be able to thrive and multiply. And if you have large blocks of land that are cut off, then I don't think that enhances that particular movement or the thriving or multiplying. And I think that, you know, if, I mean, on my son's farm in Somerset, I mean, we have conservation headlands virtually in our field. And we have seen incredibly little drop in our overall yield from the whole field, because you get pollinators that exist there. You also get the predators who are ready to consume the pests the moment they arrive, the aphids and so on, in your fields. And I actually think that is the best way to do it. It's also rather a false dichotomy, because focusing on, you know, chemical production, etc., from land is never going to be particularly good for water, not in the end, in the long run, for our soils either. So I think in long-term sustainability, you know, 50, 60 years, I think that land sharing is better. And you go come to my farm in the autumn, and you bend down and you see the conservation strip, which is not much wider than this room, around the field. And the whole thing is buzzing with insects. The insects, you know, you look down and you can see them above. And insects are the key, they're the sort of, you know, the basis of all bird life, all wildlife there is. And you know, in UKCH, they reckon that just with conservation headlands, you may get a 2% drop in overall yield, but you get a triple yield growth in biodiversity from it all. And I actually think that land sharing is the solution rather than land sparing.
I think it's great to hear that first-hand account. I promised myself I would avoid using the terms land sharing because I just think it's a sort of it's a bit of a polarized debate, and actually on the ground, farmers probably, you know, they're not thinking in quite in those terms about that sort of policy debate. But anyway, I've failed already. But Tom, do you think landowners are kind of, do you reinforce that view that sort of landowners are up for change?
Yeah, I mean, I work with computers rather than people. But yeah, from what I know, landowners want to do the right thing, and if they're supported to do so with the right advice if necessary and with the right financial support, then change is already happening for the better. Yeah, I'm sorry for starting the S.
Oh no, fantastic.
But you know, the sort of stuff that Lord Cameron is describing, you know, we're experiencing the same on our SDB farms. You can boost farmland nature with, you know, in many cases, a relatively little to no impact on yields. but that doesn't benefit, not every single species benefits from that sort of thing. You can't get Capicani through your headlands. So, and that's why I think this 3-compartment approach with aspects of both has value.
Yeah, I accept that. It's a sort of continuum, really.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not one or the other. That's what I'm saying. And everyone should apply their own experience to their own particular plot of land to work out the best way of doing it. Yeah,
Great.
But I think it's right. I think, that change is happening, but the problem at the moment is that it's happening in the absence of a sort of clear strategic kind of guidance from governments in terms of what they expect in terms of land use. And I think that's what we're all hoping the land use framework will correct and allow that change to happen, but in an aligned way, so it delivers against all these different areas. Dustin, do you want to?
Anti-democratic way. I think it's important to stress that, because one of the reasons why we're trying to render explicit some of the decisions you have to make on these trade-offs is because they're contentious, they're political. There are situations in which we are making decisions about how we want to work and changing incentives for people. We think being explicit and clear and being able to say, I like that, I don't want a pure land sparing approach, I don't want a pure land sharing, but whatever, that's important in building the consensus that will enable us to move that.
And the next session, I think it would be really nice, because that's about how communities can get involved in this change and can feed into the process. Right, finally, having said it, I'm going to go out to the audience for questions now. Zoe, do you want to go first?
Yeah, hi, Zoe Davis from Royal Society. We're probably on this topic next week, so I was sort of being immersed in it, and we'll try and be succinct with my question, although I could ask 100. I agree, Lord Cameron, with your idea about prioritising multifunctionality to an extent, but I also agree with Dustin that you need to acknowledge trade-offs and be honest about them. And there is a biophysical trade-off between food production and biodiversity. However, science and innovation could help to shift that trade-off and reduce it or even eliminate it over time. And I just wanted to ask about your opinion on things like genetic technologies, precision agriculture, things that might fall under the kind of broad umbrella on sustainable intensification, what role you think they play in the future, and also in terms of the analysis for this report, is the preferred scenario, did that involve sustainable intensification in the kind of high yield compartment, or yields that are the same as now with the same sort of externalities?
Before we go to Dustin to answer that question, I wonder if Helen would just like to come in on the kind of the role of some of these perhaps more controversial technologies in the future, and what you feel their role should be.
Thanks. Yeah, I didn't quite pick up all of that. The audio was a little bit fuzzy, but I think there's definitely a role for technology, and we certainly shouldn't rule that out. It will be important for food production, and also to reduce the impacts of the food that we produce, but also to enable lower impact foods to be produced. So some of the kind of the fermentation technologies, for example. So I think a lot of it is still to be sort of discovered and made sort of commercially viable. I would also just like to flag, though, that it's certainly not all about technology, and we do have a great range of crops that we could grow now in the UK, so we don't need to kind of wait for technology. We could certainly diversify a lot the sort of crops that we grow, so we can grow lentils, chickpeas, quinoa, for example, in the UK. So definitely bear in mind that kind of crop diversity as well as the role of technology.
Then are you able to
on the modelling question? So candidly, we relied on work that was commissioned for the National Food Strategy. Full disclosure, I was the chief analyst on the National Food Strategy, so this is me stealing my own homework. We assumed that yields would rise in the high yields compartment, but we didn't specify how. So we don't necessarily rely on gene editing or other genetic modification type technologies. It certainly looks plausible that you could do that with or without. The key point is we haven't been overly optimistic about yields rising, and we basically took quite a diverse view on how you might do that. So it might be the alternative crop varieties that have just been discussed. It might be a very kind of high-tech gene tech type approach. It might be small farm robots, precision targeting pesticides and fertilizers to radically reduce their use. We want lots of options to work out how we achieve that yield. I think basically we accept the analysis that RSPB and plenty of others have done, which says you do need some land that is focused on producing lots of food. You can't do that in the way in which we've done in the past of just dumping tons of pesticide and fertilizer on and screwing up your waterways. And we sought to build as much space for agroecological low or zero input systems precisely because of things like water quality, cultural questions, we can perhaps come on to this, and the sort of benefits that we know come from organically managed types of systems as well.
Great, thanks. And yeah, looking forward to the Royal Society's contribution to this debate next week. Yes, yeah, dental.
Thank you. Archibald Price, Dental Estate, I'm one of those landowners that you might be targeting with this report, which I think is very interesting. What does the panel think about the role of measuring outcomes and judging success on outcomes rather than particularly the approach we've seen in the past of supporting defined actions as being a method to encourage multifunctionality and perhaps a method to support the local decision-making elements that have been being mentioned as being very important. And also an offer that anyone writing reports, if you want to come and see an example of how we're trying to do this on one particular piece of land, is very well.
Oh, thank you. I know DEFRA a few years ago did look at sort of trying to make their agri-environment schemes much more outcome based, so it's payments on outcomes rather than payments for, oh, you planted a hedge, tick, regardless of whether it then, you then let it die. But I don't know enough about, I know that it's very challenging to actually do that in a rigorous kind of way with public money. But I don't know if Tom or Dustin knows any more about that. Or?
Well, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, you always seem to be much more sensible. If you're trying to produce skylarks, say, for instance, you pay for the number of pairs of skylarks you've got on your farm, as opposed to just for the headland or the habitats that someone's producing, because you've got to drive the farmer to actually to learn and really understand about what they are trying to do, he or she, and become an expert in it. And all too often, in the past, anyway, I think it really is beginning to change. A lot of farmers, sort of grew the headland, but didn't really have any interest in what it was actually producing, what it was doing, and so as a result, it wasn't necessarily particularly successful. But I think that is beginning to change. But I gather, as you say, that DEFRA looked at it and found it was too complicated with public money. But this is where I think actually what I was saying earlier about getting a local involvement in this, local involvement in the ELM scheme, checking and monitoring and helping. And DEFRA don't seem to be. I mean, I know in Somerset, where our family farm, where I used to farm, I mean, the flag officer there is absolutely overworked. He can't possibly keep up. And there's no help for farmers. DEFRA have got to, the farmers, most farmers who have long since left college need training in all of this. And they'd probably love to have it. They really would. But there isn't any. It's hard for them to leave the farm. And so we need some form of local input to help farmers produce the goods, the outputs that you're talking about.
That's great. Dustin, do you want to...
Just on outcomes, I mean, clearly that's the right approach in the long run. Paying for outcomes rather than paying for actions. There are two challenges, I think. First is measurement. So Georgia mentioned some of the challenges of measuring soil carbon. So carbon is going to be an outcome-focused thing, whether we like it or not an action-focused thing. There's a gap, I think, between what policymakers think we can measure and what scientists tell me we can measure, and that's a problem when it comes to DEFRA's policymaking process. I'll put it as gently as that. The other is variability. you can't, if you're paying on outcomes, nature varies, and it's difficult. You're a landowner, you will know it's difficult to manage variable income streams. So there's a question about the extent to which the state kind of averages that out to make for viable businesses. The one thing I would say, the advantage of outcomes is, one of the challenges I observe in speaking to farmers about shifting land uses is that food production is imbued with a deep sense of pride, and it comes out of that Second World War experience, like fed the nation, fed the world. Other types of land management don't have that same sense of pride. And if you just say to someone, we will pay you to do this dumb activity, like, shove the screw in the hole type thing, there's no pride in that. Whereas if you say, restore nature, and we'll reward you for doing really amazing things, we're doing better than your neighbor, for building the most beautiful wetland or whatever, then there's the opportunity to say, I made this and I did a great job. And that creates pride, which I think is, this is a technical report, but it's the human factors that will determine whether or not the technical stuff succeeds.
Thanks, Dustin. Just while we're on the subject of soil carbon, I wonder if I can take one of the questions from online. So it's from Harry Studland, who I think used to be chair of the Forestry Commission, so presumably knows a bit about it. He said, as a farmer and forest manager, I monitor both my soil carbon and my trees as a carbon sink. If I accept payment for increased carbon storage, I'm effectively selling an asset, which I then have the liability of maintaining in future. Is there a way of creating a more motivating mindset? I mean, I know this sort of relates to the previous session, but is this kind of, how do you incentivize people to do the things you want them to do? I have to admit, working with Dustin for about 5 years, I've never seen him stumped, but he actually, I don't think he's got an immediate answer.
I'm very sorry, I was partially parsing the question there. Sorry,
I've got a bit of an answer.
Oh, yeah, great, Georgia, thank you.
I think maybe this is sort of getting back to the question, which is the additionality problem.
Yeah.
And financing, because if a farmer or a landowner is already taking or carrying out a certain action, which they deem to be the right and the good action for a number of different reasons, can you justify, definitely not with public money, starting to pay them for that action? So I think that really the question boils down to, what are we going to do about additionality?
Yeah.
And how do we factor that into our broader long plan, and how we ensure that people can still be incentivized and paid to sustain certain methods?
Yeah.
But it is additional, or question the additionality.
Yeah. Well, this is when I was working on agri-environment policy in DEFRA about 10 or 15 years ago, we were struggling with exactly the same thing in designing environmental stewardship. So if anyone's got the answer to that one, then we'd be really interested. Yeah, sorry, you at the back there.
Yeah, my question is with regards to one of the country I come from. My roots is from India, and everyone knows, going all the way back to the Soil Association, that India is well known for its farm quality soil and many other things. So in my state in India, northeast, the land is dishevelled, it's deforested, it's mined, everything. But the thing that we are deforesting our own lands for is not to grow crops that we need for ourselves, because that stopped a long time ago. If you look at Africa, India, we're growing corn, wheat, maize. We're not growing the crops we used to, because as soon as the empire thing came in, it was about predominantly growing 4 crops, including cotton, for Western exports. So that's the first thing. That imagine 1 billion people in India, 1 billion Africa, and 1 billion China are basically breaking their backs to make and grow products which they cannot afford, and it's just for the preserve of the West. But my question is that you're talking about preserving land here, when we're mining the resources in India, it's not for food, it's not for coal, it's for lithium, cobalt, bauxite. So on one side, you want to talk about preserving the land, on the other side, you want to talk about a Green New Deal. But you want to, it seems people want to have their cake and eat it, because how can you have the green renewables and at the same time, the whole of the global south is being ripped to shreds so you can get the cobalt and the lithium to make these green renewables, which is absurd. But the last thing I want to say is India is fed up of this colonialism. that came in the 70s, which was the Green Revolution. And India got mothballed by this GMO science, displacing their science of thousands of years indigenous, which is growing crops their way. So how is it possible to go on this green transition? 3 billion people in the global south are going to be going down another route of colonialism just to make and grow products for the global north. And we're going to have to deal with waste of it, not in the UK, not in the US. So when is this colonialism going to be reversed and we get our indigenous rights back?
I think, thank you. I think, you know, you've raised some really good points there. And on the rare earth materials, Green Alliance did actually do a report on it a couple of years ago, which there might even be people in the room who know about it, who you can talk to in the break, but it did talk about having to move to a much more circular economy with those materials so that we don't have to do that extraction and don't have to have that negative impact, and it is possible to do. But I mean, I think you raise a really interesting broader point, which is about the kind of, you know, this report has looked at the UK and I know it has taken into account whether we'd be exporting emissions. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about that, Dustin, about how we can make sure that, you know, we don't create a beautiful landscape for this country while exporting those negative impacts.
So it's a big, complicated, challenging question. I guess I'd say we tackled a little bit of it by looking at overseas land use, and by looking particularly at the overseas land use the UK relies on for both food, but also for feedstocks for bets across the range of scenarios. So you'll see in that there's a table at the back, which gives you some indications. Some of the scenarios reduce the total amount of land that the UK uses overseas, and some of them increase it. We think that's important because as environmentalists, we are concerned about nature overseas, as well as nature in the UK. And there are also interesting questions which are raised about colonialism, about whether it's fair to use other people's land, all the sorts of things that were in the question there. So we have some kind of beginnings of a little bit of analysis anyway that help answer your question.
And Helen, I wonder if from a sort of Chatham House perspective, you can say a little bit more about that international dimension.
About the what dimension, Belinda? Sorry, you just cut off at the end there.
The international dimension and this issue of kind of export, you know, we under the UNFCCC process, we report our kind of production, the emissions we create from production, but of course not the ones from consumption. And big, you know, countries like the UK consume an awful lot, and it does have a negative impact on poorer parts of the world.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And I think it comes back to one of the points I raised in my reflections about really going to those maximum scenarios. So, for example, you know, rich countries such as the UK, who have a long history of deforestation and carbon emissions, for example, and biodiversity loss, not just in the UK, but across the world. I think it just makes more sense for those sorts of countries to be reaching their maximum scenarios. And we actually published a report in November looking at the G7 and some of these issues globally as well, to look at their impacts on land use, particularly in carbon rich countries such as Brazil, across the Congo Basin, and Indonesia, for example, and all of the sort of trade relationships that are ongoing. And the sort of key points from that were that we need to halt deforestation, we need to restore lost carbon sinks and lost biodiversity, and also help other countries to do that as well. So I think there's a lot of points in that, and it's certainly not a simple topic, but I think it's a really important one, and it does lead back to the UK not just sort of meeting its own goals and almost kind of doing as little as possible to meet those goals, but actually going beyond that to what is the maximum potential that the UK could actually do.
Thanks very much, Helen.
Sorry, but the UK is not reaching any goals when, if you want renewables, you have to remove the forests. It's really simple, and you need to dig up the coal. So again, countries want to eat their cake at the same time. you want the coal and the lithium and the cobalt, then destroy that land, destroy the people. Then you'll have the renewables, but then don't plant your foreign corporate trees in those countries at the same time.
Yeah, I take your point, but I think that there is a lot that can be done through reusing these precious resources rather to avoid mining them.
They didn't give the rights to be mined in the first place.
But I think we don't want to, you know, we've got a limited amount of time, so I'm going to avoid going down that kind of rabbit hole, and maybe
Exerting that ethnic minority voice in this white privileged world.
Can I just say that I've been to Bihar in India and seen good examples of good farming and bad farming. And I entirely accept the point you're making about the orphan crops, both there and I spent a lot of time looking at agriculture in Africa. People shouldn't be growing maize. Maize is a Mexican crop and it's actually nutritionally not particularly good. Millet is a far, far better crop. It also doesn't, because it's got a hard shell, doesn't suffer so much from the post-harvest losses you get in Africa. So, I mean, and the largest growing food markets in the world is the African urban food market. The population there is doubling over the question of sort of, you know, two decades, and it needs a lot of attention. And you know, I mean, some people in England are trying very hard to help, but we've got to, but you're quite right. We've got to get away from traditional kind of wheat. Even they call our potato Irish potato. Whereas sweet potatoes is far better than that.
So I think I think you know, you've raised some really good points that we, you know, unfortunately there's not a sort of easy answer to. I would like to allow a couple more people to ask different questions, and then I'll ask the panel for their final comments. So there's been a question online about another thorny issue, pardon the pun, which is about rewilding, and this kind of which again is a term that you know has people have quite polarized views on. So they've said, to what extent does the panel think that increasing uptake in rewilding by private landowners might limit land access for food growing? And I guess it comes back to this kind of semi-natural habitat you've got in your scenarios, Dustin. Is that what are you envisaging that as kind of rewilded land?
I'm going to slightly dodge the question, much in the way I slightly dodged the Royal Society's question, in that we haven't specified this is definitely rewilding or not. There is a separate question about whether you want to allow land, which, as we've classified as semi-natural habitat, to do its own thing in a rewilding kind of context, or whether you want to manage it in some particular way. That all we've specified is we need some carbon outcomes from that, and we need some nature outcomes from that. And on semi-natural land, the nature outcomes are the Capercaillie type nature outcomes, i.e. the types of nature that doesn't do well on farmland. What we have done is we have essentially guaranteed the tenure of that land. So if you're a farmer, in our scenarios, you wouldn't be, I mean, you could choose to sell, that's anyone's choice, but you wouldn't be asked to leave the land in order to change things. I just want to say that I know that most rewilders don't want to charge people off the land. That's actually a bit of a slur against rewilding, but that is where I think the dimensions of this debate tend to go. It's either sweep people off the land for pure nature and some kind of, I don't know, Neolithic fantasy, or, you know, pursue a totally the opposite. Part of the point of getting into a bit of technical details, move past these kind of scare stories and into something where we're beginning to interact and be able to drive change.
Thanks. And Tom, what's the RSPB view on this issue? Or maybe that's not fair. What's your view?
I think we're still working through some of those issues. I mean, the way I see it, yeah, this semi-natural habitat, you can manage some of it, you can rewild some of it. The definitions are blurry anyway, just as people, you know, land sharing means different things to different people. I think you asked about food production, and you know, in a sense, you can get some quantity of food from rewilded land, from natural and semi-natural habitats, whether it's wild venison or blackberries that you've foraged, or you know, meat that you've harvested from cattle, for example. So you can produce food from that land, whatever you call it. The issue is that, you know, you're quantitatively producing much less food than you would be if it was managed as, you know, farmland. And yeah, I mean, this comes down to, you know, choices about where we do that rewilding. You know, should we focus it on less productive parts of the country? We probably should, but there are still other things happen in those less productive parts of the country that we don't necessarily want to do away with. There are culturally important landscapes. There are species like curlew, which do well in you know, extensive pastoral landscapes that might be negatively impacted by rewilding, for example. So it's not just the case that the less productive land is available for rewilding. And then that gets me back to things like dietary change and those technologies which free up that space within the food system.
Great, thanks very much, Tom. In the I'd love to take more questions, but we've got to finish up in the next couple of minutes. So I was wondering if I could ask the panelists to kind of make some final comments, and perhaps framed around, you know, I think that the key question is kind of, you know, we've got this modelling, you know, that we think there is willingness amongst landowners to change. You know, there are ways communities can hopefully get engaged in that change. What do we want from government in this land use framework that they're producing to kind of make it happen? And I should probably, you know, say perhaps not just from government, what do we also want in the Labour manifesto to kind of coming up to the next election to actually kind of make this change at pace actually happen? I think I'll start with you, Dustin, if that's all right.
I will come to the land use question. I want to give you 3 numbers that are useful to leave with you the idea that we can move fast. The first is that only a quarter of farms actually make money from producing food. 75% of farms in the UK can make money from either the rural payments we give them or diversification income, glamping, offices and stuff like that. That's a huge opportunity because it's not like you have to shift most farms' basic economics off food production to other things in order to change how we use that. The second number I want to leave you with is the bottom 20% least productive land in England, and England is the majority food producer in the UK, produces 3% of the calories we produce, 1.5% of the calories we consume. There is an opportunity to change that land without much loss of food production at all. Third number is, if I feed 100 calories of grain to a cow, I get 3 calories of beef out of it. Again, there's a huge optimization here. If we can shift what we eat only a little bit, you get massive sorts of gain. So that's where I would start with the kinds of shifts that we need to see. But on to your question, I think the land use framework needs to be super explicit about trade-offs. That's why we have sought to expose some of the trade-offs there. It needs to empower landowners and farmers with data, because we cannot make intelligent decisions without knowing what the opportunities for land are and what kinds of things that we might do that's different. And finally, I think it needs to be explicitly spatial. It needs to say, on this type of land, this kind of thing, here's a natural capital asset you have. Here's something you might be able to do. Here's an opportunity that will allow both a national and a local conversation about how we might want to change things.
Thanks, Dustin. Tom, what's your wish list?
Yeah, so I think I would add to Dustin's points, which I agree with. So I think Elm is looking like one of the main delivery mechanisms for the sorts of changes that we want to see on land, at least in England. And I think it's important that that is adequately funded. There's a big risk that we rely on this scheme and the funding for that gets eroded over time. I think the Green Alliance report proposed linking Elm and linking the land use framework through to those statutory targets, which could be a way of guaranteeing that funding over the longer term. And linked to that, I think the point came up earlier about advice for farmers and land managers, and make sure that's adequately resourced, because many land managers want to do the right thing but don't always know how to do that, or they need some advice. So restoring some of the levels of advice that we had in the past, I think there's a lot of potential there.
Great, thanks, Tom. Helen, what are your views on what the government needs to do to make this happen?
Yeah, very simple. I think clearly we need a drastic departure from business as usual, and this Green Alliance report really adds some good numbers to that message. We need transformative and urgent action that matches the scale of the challenge, going back to a point I made earlier. Bear in mind that carbon sinks take decades to restore, so there's really no time to waste on this. It has to be done right now, essentially.
Lord Cameron, I know you've written a whole report on this, but So
I think probably, I mean, sort of main point of that shape, over the past 70 years, we've been focusing on one output from land, which is food production. And we mustn't focus on one output from land, whether your views are biodiversity, forestry, energy, wherever it might be. Again, we must make sure that we have a multifaceted outputs. And I'm sure it's possible to do. In terms of my message to the government is get on with it. I mean, Elms has been coming and help. I mean, was it Justin who was saying, you know, the farmers need to be proud about what they're doing, and they could be, and they want to help harness most farmers' enthusiasm for what they can produce in their land. I mean, not only food, which is what they've been proud of in the past, but also all the other outputs that we've been speaking about earlier, and help them do that. Give them the training, put some money into that, and I'm sure that we can make a really big difference. I know that the farming community, we've got a long way to go. I mean, we're only at the beginning of these changes, quite dramatic changes, but most of the farming community are pretty well on side, but they just need that little bit of help and, you know, and incentive. I'm sure we can make it work.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Thank you to everyone. I'm sorry we didn't have the time to get to all the questions that were asked, and that we didn't have time to go into the depth that we might have liked to into some of these areas. But I think it's a really exciting time for land use policy, and hopefully in the next year or so we'll start to see some of the changes that kind of envisaged in this report. So will you join me in thanking our panelists?